So is watercolor paper actually necessary for painting watercolor? To be honest, that's what this video was supposed to be about, but instead you have half of me just testing it out and half of me criticizing because I'm failing a lot. Well, failing in that I thought I knew how to do watercolor somewhat with the few tries I did before, but yeah, I don't know what I was expecting. Well, I do know what I was expecting. I thought if I understood it, I would be able to apply it, but yeah, there's still a lot more to learn, and actually being able to do it is harder than you would think, at least harder than I thought anyway. I tried making a nice sky, and honestly, I mean, looking at the video of it, it looks better than when I was actually doing it. That being said, what you're gonna see is basically a few minutes of me looking like I'm getting somewhere. Maybe, I don't know, maybe to people who are more experienced in this, they will might be shaking their heads. But I just continue to make it worse. And so yeah, that's why I had high hopes coming into this, because like, okay, I'm gonna take this seriously. I'm not just gonna draw a tree. I'll try to actually make a composition where I have a foreground, a background, a midground, and try to actually make use of watercolor and how nice it looks with landscapes. However, I guess I gave a good enough try, but yeah, it didn't really pan out the way I expected. Then again, I only came into this with minimal planning, and I also probably should have tested out some painting strokes and ideas I had in my head. Because I had it in my head, but I didn't think to actually try it out to see if it actually would work out the way I thought I visualized it would work. That's why the second half of this video is me basically backtracking and doing that step after what I should be doing beforehand, and just trying to figure out what kinds of techniques is necessary to make certain like style of or images. Like in my head, I have a certain idea of how the clouds are supposed to look, kind of dreamy and just very cloud-like. I felt like watercolor would be just the perfect medium to really capture that. And I still do think it is, but I certainly have not yet found the way I can do that. Same thing with like rolling hills and foliage, grass, and maybe mountains, although I feel like other mediums are better for mountains. However, this is a far away mountain, so I figured it should still work. The idea is in place, but the execution is still lacking, which, this is the realistic journey of trying to learn something new. I had this misguided conception that I'm fairly okay in art, I have solid basics, I can draw, but that doesn't necessarily translate to every medium. You might have some idea of what you ought to do, and that's maybe a better starting ground for most people that have no idea where to start. I know what I'm doing wrong, and I think that's something that is a bit of an advantage, but trying to actually be able to figure out, okay, so how can I get this idea in my head to work? That is something that's going to take more than just, well, up to this point, 3 semi-serious tries, besides of kind of just fooling around with the paint. With that being said, I started this picture actually quite a while back, but I got really disheartened because it wasn't panning out the way I expected. And so I left it to dry for a while after I got to a certain point, and I never got back to really finishing it until quite a bit while later, which is probably a good thing, sort of. I still got disheartened the second time around. But giving that break really gives a chance to consider what exactly are my expectations going into this, and to, well, basically lower them. And to really hone in more and more about what I am missing, lacking, and just everywhere that I can improve. And so my idea of this, for the foreground anyway, the background, even though it's not executed greatly, is still this roughly the idea that I did want. But for the foreground, which was trees, the tops of the trees, I wanted you to be overlooking it. And you would see some closer branches and leaves, like right up in the front. But I couldn't really figure out a way to execute that. And so yeah, I got really disheartened, and I was like, I'm just gonna put a black frame around it. Which didn't even look that great. It was supposed to be straight, but then I didn't press the tape down and it leaked. Which actually kind of looks cool, but at the same time made it worse. So yeah, instead of keep trying to salvage it, I knew it was just going to get worse. Because if there's one thing I understood about watercolor even back then, it's that the more you try to work at it, the more it's just going to look bad. It's not really something you can fix. Once you lay it down, it's there. Like, you can try to pick it up, but if you try picking it up, it's going to look bad. So here I try figuring out what kind of look am I going for, what kind of style am I looking for, and how can I figure out how I can create that. And so I try a wet on wet technique all the way on the left for the trees. In the middle is just a wet, just right on dry, which is definitely what I prefer. And it's definitely easier in a sense when trying to work within a certain limit of constraints of time. And then the last one was just not really dry on dry, but just not as wet. It didn't really do that much, I'll be honest, so I'm just gonna ignore that one. But yeah, the middle one is definitely the one I'm going for, and I still can't seem to figure out how I can get really nice blended colors together without creating any kind of cauliflower. I was actually surprised that cauliflowers could still kind of exist. It doesn't really look that bad when you see it afterwards, but when you're doing it, it just doesn't feel right. It's interesting because watercolor dries differently than how you would lay it down, which, I mean, makes sense, but it does make it harder to really control what you're trying to go for, because sometimes you could do it perfectly the way you want it, that's going to create the look you want, but then it still might not end up looking like it. I don't know if it's a matter of consistency or if something is still missing technique-wise. But yeah, I tried drawing how the tree branches will look on top of it, and try putting leaves then on top, trying out different techniques where I'm trying to really create a lot of texture with the leaf, or shape really. I guess not really much texture to it, but yeah, the shape, which, is not bad, but also not great. It is interesting how it lays with the colors in the back. And this was more of the method I did with my first tree watercolor. The second one, I tried doing more of the abstract, just kind of puff, almost like as if it was a cloud. This is the style that I typically see, which I do prefer more. However, I'm not quite sure what composition would be good for that, because it doesn't really work for foreground, I think. It really only works for like a midground. So that means I would have to do something like a more textured one. In this one, I'm trying to recreate something I saw where you can have the colors kind of mix on the paper. It does kind of work, but yeah, I don't know, maybe I just gotta work on the execution. So yeah, trying out these techniques. The grasses, as always, looks really nice with watercolor. There's not really much to improve on there, or to make it look much worse. It's just literally a stroke. Here I try a little drier watercolor, which creates really nice texture, really. Which, I have seen that used for foliage in the back. But the thing is, it's hard to control. I'm still really working on how to control water, because even the dryness or the wetness, they both last for only a certain amount of time. So even if you get it perfect, it's gonna go away in like a few strokes. That's really one of the difficult parts of watercolor that I'm really struggling to capture how to control. Then moving on to color mixing for the clouds. What I noticed about the clouds is that I create the shape of the cloud better with the bottom of the brush than the top. And I really tried to figure out how can I capture that. So I tried like flipping the brush upside down, but it's still hard to figure out how I can use it realistically because it doesn't quite work. So that's definitely another thing I have to figure out how to do. So yeah, you can see me trying to. It's interesting because even the top of it, when I try to flip my brush upside down, then it gives it more shape. But it's a shape that I'm still figuring how to control it. Then I try cityscape with the clouds again, trying to figure out how can I put clouds in like the background of something, even far away or up close. And it's just, it feels like it ought to be simple. Even when I'm looking back on this, it's like, oh, I just did this or that, but then actually doing it. Yeah, so needless to say, even while I was doing this exercise, even though I was learning a lot and figuring out, okay, so this kind of techniques create this kinds of effect, it still was discouraging. Because even then, with the practice, I wasn't creating quite what I expected. I will say though, color mixing, it feels like you feel like such an expert doing it, but the thing is, I wasn't making much of anything, it felt like. Yeah, so this is not really your most inspiring, motivating kind of video, but it's a realistic one. So, yeah, that's it for now. That's next step in the journey, and thank you for watching.